The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the hosts and guests, and not necessarily those of the staff or management of Worldwide Digital Broadcasting Corporation.
Hot topics, food, fun, entertainment, and serious business. Live Las Vegas with Rikki Cheese.
Glad you folks could join us. This is one of those shows that is about serious business. Some huge topics here in our community, and an opportunity to talk to two women who are just chairing two of the biggest groups that are making a big difference here in the community, and one of them really needs your help. Joining me today on Live Las Vegas with Rikki Cheese, Stacy Lockhart from Shade Tree. She just started her job in July. This is the best part. They both just started. And Liz Ortenburger from Safe Nest, she just started in March. Now, let's talk about the difference in both organizations, because one of the things that happened in this past couple of weeks was that you came forward because one of your major programs, Stacy, is ending. One of the things that it was unfortunate, but what I did like about it was it then sparked a discussion in the community again about some of the widespread problems with homelessness and domestic violence, and even to some degree mental illness, things that we don't really want to talk about. But the transitional housing program at Shade Tree was what really got this whole discussion started. So tell us about that.
Well, we are suspending our transitional housing program. It is a program where women can come and spend up to 365 days. And that is a different program from our emergency shelter program, which women can stay in for up to 90 days. As you mentioned, I am new on the position. And one of the things I have learned, and I didn't even understand, was that with our 90-day emergency shelter program, we have to have them out in 90 days. If they stay longer than 90 days, they're no longer considered homeless, and they aren't able to access other community services at that point. So that's why we have a 90-day stay on that. The transitional program was for women if they were in for the 90 days and they needed more time and they were going to put together a longer term plan. We could then move them to our third floor. They'd enter the transitional program, work very closely with job development, case managers, other community services, and over the course of up to 365 days, really develop a plan, take life skill classes, gain employment, put a portion of their earnings aside in savings during their stay. So as they exited at the end of their stay, they would be prepared to move into an apartment or a home, know that they had income coming in, and they had some savings set aside so they could sustain themselves long term.
Right.
The transitional shelter, we actually have a lot of grant funding, and it's great, but grant funding's not sustainable and it's not guaranteed from year to year. It runs at cost, there's 160 beds in that program available, and at a cost of about $40 a day, we're looking at $2.3 million if we were to have 160 women in that program, to be able to have them there for a year for each one of them. We are looking to the community. We are reinvigorating community, private philanthropy, and we want to attract the kind of funding that will allow us to sustain that program long term. And that's why the campaign #InvestInUs. We are a great community asset. We have incredible economic impact on the community as well. And each one of the ladies that go through the program and then are able to step out and be independent and self-sufficient, they also in turn have economic impact on this community. So we are a wise investment. Right. The program will come back at some point. People have asked me how soon, and I said, you know what, it's entirely up to the community. How fast they want to step up and help fund that and help us reach our goal. If we're there by the end of December, we'll be able to look at bringing it back online. If it takes us longer, then it will stay offline longer until we know that we've got the funding and the type of funding that will allow us to reopen that program long term.
Right. Now, your program deals with homelessness primarily, even though there are some elements of domestic violence, but Safe Nest is entirely about domestic violence.
Yes, so we've been in Las Vegas for 40 years, celebrating our 40-year anniversary in October, and we have, for the life of our agency, only dealt with domestic violence as the underlying issue for whatever the situation may be. So we take domestic violence victims that would be homeless if they didn't have a place to go. We work with domestic violence victims who have mental health issues, as well as substance abuse issues. But the common denominator for everybody that we work with is domestic violence, and that weaves that piece together, which allows us to do a basket of support and wraparound services in that field. So from prevention programs all the way through therapy programs, we have something each step of the way as a victim works from crisis to confidence.
And in your program, it's not open. You know, you've got how many beds, and these beds are hidden away. So for a good reason.
Absolutely. So as much of the community knows, but the time when domestic violence is at its most lethal, and we are consistently one of the highest counties for lethality in domestic violence, is when a victim is trying to leave or has left their abuser. So our shelter is 100% confidential. We have 71 beds, and in that program at that location we house women and children, and then we have other confidential locations that we work with for men who need access to domestic violence care and their children.
What are you ladies running into in the community as you go out now, and now the spotlight has been shown once again on these issues that, let's face it, people are uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. And even my station owner, he said, we were talking before the show, there is still this perception in the community, especially when it comes to homelessness, that, well, they're just lazy. If they didn't, if they just wanted to get out there and they could get a job, and they're just sucking off the community and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah. Well, as it relates to domestic violence, the biggest question that I get all the time is, why doesn't she leave? Or why don't they leave, in reference to the victim? And when we look at society as a whole, many people tuned into a fight on Friday night that had a domestic violence abuser winning that fight. But as society, we haven't taken a step back and said, wait a second, we don't uphold that. That's okay for us. We're going to tune in, and he's going to walk away with $32 million or whatever that paycheck was. As a society, we haven't said enough. We continue to victim blame. We continue to say, why didn't she leave? She was in it for the money, or put the blame on the victim. What we need to do is flip the narrative and say, why do we live in a society where a batterer believes it's okay to use abuse, physical, financial, emotional, to have their needs met? And until we start to dig in and understand that piece, it becomes very difficult to say, how do we eliminate 60,000 phone calls for the police every year? Right. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, both in the immediate crisis space and in the prevention space. But yeah, it's very difficult.
I think as well, first of all, our priority for intake is to provide that emergency shelter to women and children that are in fear of their life from domestic violence. And those are the first people that we take into the shade tree. Further than that, I think that we need to have conversations in the community broader about domestic violence. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you have a PhD. It doesn't care if you live in a $2 million neighborhood or if you're in a lower income part of town. And so to stereotype and say, people who are homeless or women who are abused, it's everywhere. It's in every part of our community. And so we first need to take that stereotype away. And homelessness, it can happen to anybody. A lot of times it could be as a result of overwhelming medical costs. Losing a home.
Or losing your job.
Exactly. And there are many people who are homeless that They are out there pounding the pavement and looking for work. They're trying to navigate the best they can, but it's hard if you don't know where to turn or who's there with services. And so we also need to remember that we need to connect people. And not just look at them on the street as we're driving by and assume they're lazy or they don't want a job. Many of the women I have met at the Shade Tree, the circumstances they come from, they're very individual, and everybody has their own. You can call them demons or instances, whatever it is they're dealing with that got them there, and we need to take it case by case, and we need to work with them as individuals and develop those plans and hook them to the services that are best going to help them achieve their goals. So they're not lazy. There's lazy people in all walks of life, let me tell you, and some of them are making very good money. So I think the conversation isn't about that.
Right.
It's about bringing it back to what is the cause and what's happening in the community, and how do we collaborate with our partners in the community so we can best help them access those services and stand on their own 2 feet and be independent, be safe, and not have to be worrying about looking over their shoulder or hiding. Those are all things that together we need to address.
Yeah. The underpinnings of both of your programs, even though they're different in terms of domestic violence and homelessness, are giving these women and their children the ability, the life skills, whatever got them there, to give them the tools to move forward and to have a more productive life.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about funding. One of the things that I noticed is that there is a concern now about federal funding, given the current administration and whatever's going on. But one of the things that you guys are talking about is the uncertainty of the federal funding and how much that you get, and how you have to basically, you're thinking about weaning yourselves off of it because you know that's not a guarantee. That's a slippery slope now.
Well, in federal funding, federal funding is really you get it and you need to spend it. You get it and you need to spend it. And so for nonprofits that are heavily reliant on federal funding, the ability to build a reserve or be able to invest in research and development, what programs are new, what things could work, who could we collaborate with that may take some dollars to make that work, the federal funding doesn't give you an arena for that. And because of our state, love it or hate it, there's no income tax. Most of the money that we get that's state-driven is either federal pass-through funds coming through a state agency or funds associated with something else, but there's very little state money available. So then we're left with, in Nevada, really federal funds or private donations, and some of the, we have the great MGM grants and all of the corporation support as well. Right. But in order to build a healthy financial portfolio as a nonprofit to weather whatever storms may be coming, you have to really understand the levers. So if a federal programming is cut back, do you know whether or not you have the money coming in from private donations, or is there a business stream different than what you're doing that will be able to continue that program? Or do you need to sunset that program, take a pause, and figure out, is there a better way for me to serve more efficiently? That is where in victim services a lot of us nonprofits struggle, is how do we build those smart things that we know businesses should have, like a reserve, when we're dependent on federal funds, and then what are the answers? Now, I used to work for Girl Scouts, and unfortunately there's no cookie sale for domestic violence, right? It doesn't work, it wouldn't work, so nobody get worried, I'm not going to try to start one. But what are the business pieces that we can put in place that help, as Stacy said, relieve that reliance on that federal funding so that you can do the right things from a nonprofit business lens?
I think what people may not realize as well is when we do receive grant funding, it is usually very specific. It has parameters built around it, what you can do, what you can't do. There's all sorts of reporting requirements. It's very management intensive. And yet, a lot of these grants, they don't cover overhead. They don't keep the lights on and the doors open and put toilet paper in the bathrooms. And that's where, as nonprofits, we need to be able to know we can pay the electric bill. Our electric bill was $8,500 in July.
Wow.
We need to be able to make sure that we've got supplies. We need to make sure that we've got the people in the right seats within our team to monitor, to administer, to do all the things we need to do in the back of the house in order to keep the front of the house going. So that's where private philanthropy is so important. And
it gives you freedom.
It does. And people talk to me all the time, where can we help the most? And I'm sure you'll probably agree. Where people can help the most is in unrestricted giving. And that's where somebody trusts us and believes in us enough to hand us some money and say, we want you to use this where you need it the most. And we know you're going to use it wisely. That gives us the most flexibility, so we can maneuver and we can look at possibly, starting a new program or testing something else, or, as you said, weaning ourselves off of some of the grants that tie our hands in so many ways.
A friend of mine who runs Rosalind Brooks, who runs Vegas Roots Community Garden, just this week, and this is such great timing to have you guys on my show, she just got a $500,000 federal grant for SNAP. And what it does is that for every $20 somebody who is on SNAP spends in a SNAP related store, they get $20 free fruits and vegetables. And then she explained to me that she's got to run through the money.
Yeah.
I thought, well, that's ridiculous. And she says, no, there's a timeline.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then we'll have to reapply for another grant, but we have to spend the money. I said, well, but she had to really break it down for me. What you guys just explained was that was the string attached. It's a 2-year grant, and you've got to be out of that money in 2 years, and that's it.
And if you don't have something to replace that at the end of 2 years, then you're looking at rolling back programs, laying off staff, and so you're always in a little bit of a crisis mode, a worry mode, because you're not guaranteed you're going to get that grant again, even if you do reapply. And so it's a bit of a guessing game. There's uncertainties around every corner, and that's why private philanthropy for us and building reserves. There are nonprofits out there. Well, and I'll just say locally, the UNLV Foundation. Higher ed is great at building endowments, and I've worked for higher ed institutions that have great endowments. Community foundations have great endowments. But when we're in a position of every day trying to figure out how we continue a program, how we feed somebody, how we keep the lights on, we don't have the luxury of having time or large staffs to do that development work day in and day out.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're proud of at Safe Nest is that about 25 years ago, we really said, okay, we've got federal funding, we've got private funding, but what can be something that we can do? How can we raise money differently? And how can we have a business sort of arm of this, right? Because we know we're not going to start charging domestic violence victims for the services that we provide. That's not allowed by some of the grant money we get, but that's also not appropriate. So we began a donation center program, and many people, we collect over 40,000 pounds of soft goods every week. And let me tell you, it's fantastic, because what we're able to do is find what's important for our shelter residents and other folks that are in our court advocacy program or the like, and then we're able to monetize. And that has given us, through the recession, as we know it hit so hard here in Las Vegas, and through other downturns, that little cushion. So that sort of creative thinking in nonprofits is so helpful, because the federal funding can come, the federal funding can go at the whim of whomever's at the helm, and we all get a little nervous about that. And that could be under any administration. And the same thing can happen with the economy and all different things. So finding that sort of, how can we have a stake that's all private giving, but also something a little different? And that donation center has done volumes for us.
Do you think, to an extent, that because you guys were doing such good work so quietly, it sort of lulled the community into a sense of well, they don't really need our help?
That's an interesting question, because with the launching of our campaign, people have called and said, you know what, we used to give to the Shade Tree all the time, but we support other organizations as well. And I don't know how it happened, but you fell off our radar until I saw the news, until I heard about what was going on. I think that nonprofits, the onus is on us to keep ourselves visible, to keep ourselves out in the community, and to communicate with our donors, and to do what we call stewardship. It's cultivating and stewarding. And I always tell people, I believe in building relationships for life.
Right.
Somebody becomes involved in the Shade Tree, they're part of our family. And we owe it to them to thank them, but to report to them, to keep them up to date. And I think there's times where, if times are lean and everyone's buckling down and just trying to do the daily work at hand, I think it's easy to forget that we need to be external, and we need to do better at that.
Right. You guys were laughing when both of your PR people came in, and I kissed them both, and I didn't kiss you guys because I said, well, the PR people are really important. They're the ones who get the word out. They're going to be the ones who return my phone calls. And so, I'm so glad to see you.
And to Stacy's earlier point, having PR staff as wonderful as they are, they don't work for free, nor should they.
Right.
It's not something generally covered by a federal grant.
Right.
So when the recession hit, and giving went down, and we saw it in soft goods as well as through our donation center, as well as in federal dollars, as well as in local dollars. We all felt that. And what a lot of nonprofits did, not out of desire to not be visible, but out of desire to survive through that, was say, unfortunately, PR is a luxury we don't have for. And that's short-sighted, but that again is a reality of, if you're only funded for this year, how do you weather a storm through 5 years, and how do you not give up the things? Because what's always sad for me when you think about domestic violence, it's oftentimes a situation of isolation for a victim.
Right.
And because we have so many people who moved to Las Vegas from other places, you think about a victim being isolated. The first thing that my team and I talk about when we dissect something that's happened within the community is, how would a victim have interacted with Safe Nest? How would they have known that we existed? And so not only did we not do a good job of communicating to the community at large what we were doing, we didn't do a good job of letting victims know what we were doing.
Right.
So how did they find us on bus maps when we weren't there? How did they find us in places where we needed to be when we weren't advertising? So it's a twofold issue, and again, not one that's funded by the federal government.
Well, and it's funny, we mentioned where things tend to be trimmed back when economic times are tighter. And in the industries I have worked in, and it never makes sense, but it's absolutely correct. Your PR communications and your development area. And it's always seemed backwards to me that it's like, well, we'll cut the development department. And I've always said, no, now's the time to invest in your development department, because we need that help even more. We need to be out there. And a lot of people don't, if they don't necessarily understand the function, they don't understand the importance of those people in that team to our organizations. We've got to have strong development departments. We need to be able to invest in capacity building. We need to be able to print posters, do some advertising. We are a nonprofit, but we are a business. And more, I think nonprofits, I'm doing it myself. We're a nonprofit, but we are a business, and we need to make sound business decisions, which means where do you trim? What's essential? What can't we do if we don't have that person in that seat anymore? And so I'm the type, I will fight tooth and nail every time to keep PR and communications and development people on the team, because they're the ones who are going to attract the friends and the funding that we need in order to expand or just continue the other side of the house.
And to defend both of you ladies, because I just recently came out of doing straight news for many, many years, and have been blessed to have this show and to be able to have a freeform discussion. But in traditional news, for gosh, I don't even know how long it's been, just doing this type of show, I think you got like maybe 6 seconds to talk to any reporter who ever came to talk to you about it. And so what are you going to do? 6 seconds, that's it. And then the whole story might have been 1:15. So you blink, you miss it. You know, and so at least you're on this show, and it's going to be on our website and on YouTube, and you can repost it, that type of thing. But TV news, the way we're doing it now, and the way we've done it for many, many years, does not cover nonprofits unless something goes wrong.
Right.
So, you know, you losing your transitional housing, we wouldn't have just come out and just done a really good story. Let's just go
Because
do
we're
a story
doing
about
great work.
Right. Let's just go do a nice story about Shade Tree. Let's do a nice story about. We wouldn't have done it. But let something go wrong. Oh, we're right there with the microphone.
Right.
Yeah, and that's just the way it is.
Well, and I think with traditional, you know, news broadcasting, in the last month, I've had some conversations that have gone on, you know, 20 minutes, a half hour. They've talked to a couple of our residents who were comfortable putting themselves out there. I mean, and my PR person, Sakisha, knows. I mean, I had to have a box of Kleenex. I was in the corner sobbing. I mean, it was breaking my heart. And yet, when I watched the news that night, there were 2 seconds of soundbite, and none of that I was able to sit there and witness and sit through. And so the community and the general public,
Right.
they're not getting the whole story. They're
Right.
getting, like you said, they're getting that minute 30 of what's condensed, and they're getting sound bites. They're not, you know, if they could be there with us for the whole thing, boy, I mean, I'd be handing out Kleenexes to everybody in the room.
Well, my photographers used to get mad at me because I'm a crier. You know, I mean, as you guys can tell, I cry. And I would just be so touched by the stories that we would get to go on, and then realize I was so limited by what I could actually show. And it was just kind of frustrating, because how do you make that emotional connection with the community if they don't get to see that part? You know, if the only part they see is the executive directors, of course, you know, you ladies have to give whatever it is, the information is out there, but they don't actually get to see the people that you're helping. You know, they don't get to feel that emotional connection or get to see it. And that was what was so great about you opening your doors and letting the community come in. I mean, you can't do that, of course, but letting them come in and say, look at these folks, this could be you. You know, this is like everybody, you talk about being a paycheck away from something. Arnold Stock at Veterans Village, he talks about that too. He loves it when his big donors will come out and bring their kids out for different things, so his kids can see another side of the community and actually interact with folks. And he says it makes a big difference.
It does. We did our campaign launch, you know, from our campus, and it was important to me that we did that, because it allowed friends of ours maybe we hadn't seen in a while to come back, to put your feet on the ground, to be in the facility, to, even if you don't get to talk to them, to walk by a room and see the women and children, to look through the window in the Children's Activity Center and see what's going on. That's what makes it real. I'm a very visual person, and I want to touch and I want to feel, and that's what I take home with me afterward. We could have done it in a meeting room somewhere or in a ballroom somewhere, but that doesn't bring it to life.
Right.
And that's what I really want to do is bring the Shade Tree, the Safe Nest, the organizations in the community. We need to come to life for people, for them to really feel connected and to feel a part of us, and that's what makes people want to help.
Well, information I didn't have until you spoke it here today is that after that 90 days, the women have to leave, and so now they're basically homeless again. So the cycle continues. I mean, I find that very frustrating.
So our program runs for 4 weeks at the emergency phase, and then residents are able to apply to be in for an additional 16 weeks so that they can find that. And there are places to get people connected with so that homelessness is not the only result. But I will tell you, as a community, particularly in Las Vegas, but I will say Clark County as a whole, we are absolutely desperate for transitional housing. And we meet with Arnie over at Veterans Village to understand what he's done as well. But as we look at community-wide investment, the idea that we would have a place for people to transition from whatever that circumstances of crisis is into confidence is an absolute need here. And every nonprofit executive that's in this victim space that I talk to echoes the same chorus: is how do we find this? How does a victim not go back to their abuser? Because if they're coming out of shelter and they don't have anything or anywhere to go, and they have 3 kids or even no kids in tow, it is very hard to not see that as their path. And so we do work. We have a housing coordinator on staff, as well as advocates that help folks get jobs and all those kinds of things. And so we really work hard to make sure that there's that basket of support. So when you graduate from the shelter program, you're graduating into confidence and not into a, well, here's a path to go back.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that point. I think people don't, they also don't understand, for us, that 90 days, that is hard. Depending on the situation somebody has left, they may, in some cases, it's like fleeing a burning building. They grab what they can grab and they run. They may not have an ID. They may have children and they don't have their birth certificates. They need to be connected. They may need help with a divorce decree. There's a lot of legal type things that they need assistance with as well, and it takes time. They also may emotionally and even physically not be in a place where in 30 days they're ready to move on. It could take them 60 or 90 days just to get to the point that they're comfortable going outside, or they're comfortable getting on a bus or going somewhere. To have a conversation with somebody, soon after they arrive, okay, well, what's your plan? You need to get a job, you need to do this, you need to do that. You just can't comprehend. You're not there. And again, everyone's very individual. Some people may only need us for a night or so because they just needed that safe place to go and they've got their plan. Right. Other people, it may take much longer. And so transitional housing, having that available in the community, whether it's 365 days or whether it's 6 months or 4 months, buys them that additional time to continue putting their house in order and their emotional state, their well-being. It gives them that opportunity to work on those things so they can then step out and, as you say, graduate from the program. Since we made our announcement, I've had phone calls from other CEOs of nonprofits in the community. I've had emails, and immediately, being new to Las Vegas, I realized what a tight-knit nonprofit community there is here, and that it is very collaborative, and people are supporting each other. People say, if we have it and you need it, it's yours. If you don't have beds and we have beds, we can put people over here. So everyone's been great about reaching out. And so now that, we're kind of off the ground and the campaign's out there, I'm looking forward to being able to take a breath and start actually making connections with my peers in the community. I think the caseworkers, the program folks, they're all hooked in with each other and work very well together. But at the executive level, CEO level, we laughed about it one day because someone contacted me and said, I'm working for an organization, we're having some of the same struggles. And I said, oh, I know, we need a support group, don't we? and she said, you're absolutely right. We really do. We need to be able to come together and talk about what our issues are, what our struggles are, what we're finding. I think when you do that, you find you're not the only one in the room that is dealing with that same thing. And to be able to put it out on the table and have conversations among each other and come up with some solutions. We're the ones experiencing it. Yeah. So how can we best share with each other, collaborate? And I always say, copy and steal everything. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. If somebody's doing something and they're doing it really well and it's working, you know what? I want to talk to that person. Sure. I want to see their facility. I want to know what they're doing and how they're doing it and why it's working so well. And then it's transferable. can we take pieces of that? Can we take things home with us that we can apply to our own organization?
Right.
And this is going to come back to the federal money, because the reality is Nevada has an allocated pool of money that we get. And so the pie is only so big. And if we all continue to fight for those federal dollars, the pie is not going to grow. It's just going to get split up in different ways. And so when we think about, look at, as a community, how do we get strategic around domestic violence? Who's in what spot doing what, and who's meeting what element of the service, so that we're not duplicating unless we need to, because the numbers are requiring duplicative services. And that's where private funding comes in. That's where I've asked the school district and the mayor, and how can we bring a commission together around domestic violence to say, this is an epidemic here. If we had 60,000 people a day doing anything else, we would be talking about it. Sorry, not a day, a year. But 60,000, if we had 60,000 calls to the police around anything else, we would be doing this differently. And so let's put a focus on this, and that includes the nonprofits coming to the table. That includes funders coming to the table and saying what makes sense for the victim. Because so often we can get lost in the business, in the donor, in the reserves, in the board, and all of these pieces, and lose sight of how do we do this for victims? Because the last thing we want to see is a victim repeat the cycle. But what we'd love to see is a victim not enter a cycle to begin with.
Right.
So what's the preventative program look
Right.
like? And how do we get the players to the table?
I say every day, boy, if we could shut our doors and close the shade tree, that would be an incredible day.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you know, where we rank for domestic violence, for the number of people we're seeing and we're serving, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So since that's not going to happen, and domestic violence isn't going to be erased off the face of the earth anytime soon, it's important that we make sure, and the community makes sure, we're there for those people who need us most.
I know this sounds like a very simple question, but just in this past week, it's been the part of the conversation. What is abuse? I find that people think it must be you hit somebody, or, you know, what is abuse?
So domestic violence is really defined by power and control. So it is any time an abuser is using power and control, and that can be physical, that can be economic, that can be emotional, that can be spiritual, that can be in any form, but they are using that power and control to get their needs met. Dinner's not on the table, I'm not going to talk to you for 2 weeks. Something didn't happen that I wanted to happen, I am now going to abuse you physically. When that intimate partner relationship is underlined by an abuser using power and control to get what they want in whatever format it looks like, that's domestic violence. I think what's hard is, yes, when I'm on the news, it's because somebody was killed. And lately, that's been happening more and more and more. And now I'm on the news when someone's killed and a child's involved. So we're seeing it escalate, and we're seeing it ratchet up, and we will see it go through cycles. But the important thing is that victims hear that if you are in a relationship in which power and control is being used, you don't have access to a checkbook, you don't have a way to be free, you're feeling isolated, that is domestic violence. And your absolute phone call should be to a hotline like the one that we run at Safe Nest for 24/7 access, so that you can start talking with an advocate. If you are uncomfortable in a relationship that you're in, call the hotline. It doesn't matter whether or not you want to define it as abuse. Call the hotline. We will help you in a non-judgmental way, find out what's going on, and then figure out, because what happens in these cycles of abuse is that it's not, oh, it's just not access to the checkbook. It's, oh, it's not access to the checkbook, and now you're holding my children against me, and it's going to continue to escalate. That may escalate to violence, and it may not, but the worst case scenario is you don't talk to somebody early, and it escalates to death. That's the worst. That's the worst case scenario, and not only your death, but the death of a loved one as well, right? Typically a child. Right. So that power and control is really the underlying mechanism of domestic violence and the reality of the disease.
Yeah.
Well, and some of your listeners may know or not know, but Noah's Animal House is also located at the Shade Tree. One form of domestic abuse, you know, injuring their pets, holding their pets hostage. So with Noah's, women are able, when they leave, they can take their pets with them, and we will shelter the pets as well with our partnership through Noah's Animal House. 93% of women won't go back to the situation if they have everything they care about with them, which includes their pets. So it's, domestic violence, yeah, it's not, you think of black eyes, you think of women in the sunglasses, but it's so many different things. And I think I had someone come in last week who shared with me she'd been in an abusive relationship for 3 years. It's been a few years about it, but for a long time she couldn't talk about it. She couldn't bring herself to talk about it. And one day she was sitting with somebody and she actually brought it up, and it's the first time she ever said anything, and they looked at her and said, "You too?" So women need to feel that they can talk about it.
Yeah.
Say something to somebody. Talk about your feelings or what you're experiencing. If you're feeling weird about it, in your head you're going, is this right? This doesn't feel normal. And I think the more we talk about it among ourselves, the more women are going to feel confident enough to step forward and either seek assistance, or somebody will say to them, you need to, this is abuse, and you need to go, let me help you. I know of the shade tree. I know of the safeness. There's people out there and places you can go. I used to know a woman who kept a suitcase packed, hidden in the back of her closet all the time. So when that moment struck, she was ready. She could grab the suitcase and leave.
But but on the other hand, she was hanging out in preparation for, she knew she was in a bad situation.
I think that's the complicated part to understand, is that it's a cycle. So in the cycle is this very loving, adoring, you're the center of my universe phase, kind of like when you first fall in love with whomever's in your life. And it's wonderful, and it's euphoric, and it feels great. Then comes tension, then comes abuse. The cycle can be long, the cycle can be short, it can vary in duration. But for so many women that I talk to that come through our doors, they're wanting to believe that this person who they love more than anybody else in the world, when they look them in the eyes with tears in their eyes and say, that was the last time,
I'm so sorry,
I will change,
it won't happen again.
I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again, that it really is the last time. And so what one of the things that we do at Safe Nest is we counsel batterers as well as victims.
Yes.
And that's a complicated world to be in, but what my counselors love about it, my therapists love about it, is that they're able to see into the mind of a batterer to help victims. We understand the disease, I think, differently. And I don't call it a disease in a way that it's like, oh, you're magically cured. But this epidemic, they understand it from a batterer's perspective in order to help the victims. But it is absolutely cyclical in nature. And the heart is not a linear, rational thinker. The mind is often not times a linear, rational thinker. And when you are in a state of confusion, and we deal with women, it's like, how do I leave when I have a child who's autistic and who has difficulty changing locations? How do I leave when I have a pet? How do I leave when I have a disabled mother? How do I leave? How do I leave? How do I leave when there's all these barriers? How do I leave? My kids just started the school year. So it's helping get on a hotline. We think on average, and we talk to a woman 7 to 9 times before she's actually ready to leave the situation. But the first step towards confidence is picking up the phone, calling a hotline, and talking to someone.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and how do you leave when you don't have access to funds?
Mm-hmm.
If you've been kept at home, and told over and over again, you know what, you got pregnant, it's your job to stay home and raise. You don't get to have a job. You can't go for education. It takes money to get on a bus. It takes money to call a taxi. Where do I stay? Can I afford a hotel room? How do we eat? It's all of those different things. Everybody's situation, again, is different and very individual. And it is cyclical. Things may get rocky, and then they may get a little better. And so you kind of ride that out and say, oh, okay, well, maybe this will be okay. But here's my safety nest back here. I've got my bag ready to go. And I don't think that anyone really ever grabs that bag and goes until they're in fear of their life.
Right.
It's amazing what you can put up with until you're truly afraid for your life.
And a lot of the victims that we talk to are ready to leave when that violence starts to hit the children. And that's oftentimes the breaking point. And it's amazing how strong victims are, and they don't recognize their own courage. But it's like, I can put up with it because he's a good father. I can put up with it because this is a stable home. I can put up with it. I can take it. I can do it. I can shoulder this. But the minute that turns on one of my children is the minute that I am ready now to call the hotline and
Final
go.
straw.
Right.
And what we know, what the data very clearly points out, is that whether a child is involved in the actual act of the abuse, whether it be physical or otherwise, a child that is in a household past the age of 13 where abuse is happening is much more likely to repeat that cycle, whether it be as a batterer or as a victim. And so our messaging to folks on the hotline is, it may not be directly touching the children in your home, but it absolutely is playing a role in who they're going to be. So let's take, and one of the great things about the domestic violence program is, as Stacy has said, we meet victims where they are. So if you're ready to come to shelter, fantastic. Let's talk about what your options are. If you're ready to leave that situation, great. We'll talk to you about what your options are. But that's it. Victims don't know. They are their own best advocates. Right. When we do safety planning, which we do a lot of, the first question we ask is, how have you been safe before? Because you are your best knowledge center. So many people have a preconceived notion. If I call or if I show up at the door, I'm going to be whisked into this new program and all of this stuff is going to happen and I'm not going to be in control. And we have done, Marissa, who runs the shelter, is amazing. She has done so much to remove any element of power and control out of the shelter environment, so decisions are made by those that are recovering for the right decisions for them. And of
You're
course,
not telling them what to do.
No, and of course we're in communal living, so that has its own set of realities. But if you don't want to make your bed, I am not coming in there with a quarter to see if your bed's made. But, if you don't want to eat, we've got systems to help you get food when you're ready, and children's programs to help the children heal when they're ready. But as to Stacy's point, when most people come to shelter, that first 4 weeks is spent primarily sleeping and healing and catching your breath, because you are coming out of generally a war zone where you left fleeing for your life, and there's post-traumatic stress syndrome and all of these pieces going on. And we in the domestic violence universe have to treat the entire person, not just the incident of domestic violence. So it's complicated.
One of the toughest stories, domestic violence stories I've ever covered, was just a couple of years ago, and I've covered stories over the years, but it's usually after the woman got out of the hospital or far after the fact. Yeah. Well, this is the one that I'm sure this happened before both of you got here. This woman was set on fire by her husband. And so my photographer and I, we were there when she drove herself to the hospital. Yeah. And she drove back from the hospital and agreed to do an interview. And I'd never seen someone who had just been beaten and set on fire. Yeah. And I'm sitting there and I'm just like, I couldn't believe that she was she in shock or what? She was just talking very calmly, and we were in the living room, and there was, the fire and everything. So we leave, and a couple of weeks later, she called the station. She wanted to see the story because she missed him. Yeah. I was just floored, but it's what you're talking about. It's like that connection was still there, and she actually told me that the officer told her that if she took him back again the next time, he would kill her. Yes. And I thought, wow. But what do you do with that? Well, you can't discount hostage syndrome, right? You can't discount what you see from active duty military coming out of a war zone. You can't discount those in a domestic violence scenario, because what happens behind closed doors is oftentimes horrific, but it is undoubtedly emotionally absolutely confusing. And what we as a society don't allow is for a victim to not be able to tell a non-linear story. We look for holes. The minute if Ray Rice had not been caught on video, that story would have been questioned from here to Sunday. Absolutely. And we don't allow the same
relaxed sort of interrogation or questioning or whatever that we do for folks coming out of war zones, that we don't allow that for domestic violence victims. And we hear that again and again. Well, her story didn't add up. Her story didn't make sense. She has basically been at war for who knows how many years, behind closed doors, isolated. So the heart doesn't always make sense. The emotions behind that don't always make sense. Children often miss their abusers in child molestation scenarios. The same is true. It's not rational. It is incredibly emotional and incredibly complex. And what we have to all learn how to do is take a step back from what's normal for us, because we're not coming out of those scenarios.
Right.
Be compassionate and create a place for people to heal. And that's what we're involved in.
So Stacy, once again, invest in us.
Yes. We, I have to say, we've had some lead gifts even before we did the launch. We received a very generous gift of Apple stock. We had a woman come in with $1,000 in an envelope that saw the story, and she said, I just knew we had to do something. I talked to my grandchildren about it. She goes, $1,000 kept coming into my mind, and I kept telling myself, that's a lot of money. She said, but I just felt it was right, and that's what I needed to do. And I mean, so it's incredible. We've been getting gifts in the mail. Like I said, our partners in the community and the nonprofit world have been reaching out to us as well. It's starting. For the first few weeks on the job, I have to say, taking a look at what our situation was, what was going on, and the hard decisions that were going to have to be made, that was hard. But once we put our plan in place, decided we were going to go forward, we were going to share ourselves with the community and be transparent and reach out and ask for community to invest in us, I have to say I started getting excited. I'm a fundraiser at heart, and so, I can see the possibilities. I know what community support can do for an organization, and so I think we're past that moment of that crisis feeling,
The panic.
and we are on the path, and we are encouraged, and we're optimistic, and we know, based on the response we've received just so far, that we can do this.
Right.
I mean, all of us can
Right.
do this.
Right. Well, I love the fact that I feel like I'm a matchmaker. That I've been able to bring them together the first two times, these two ladies. I had all these other questions I was going to ask. I wanted to ask, where you grew up. You both have like a Washington State connection. Your daughter goes there. You both spent time in Washington State. You both come from organizations. You came from the Girl Scouts into domestic violence. I mean, that was a whole other story I wanted to get into.
I was a Girl Scout.
Right, fantastic. I was a Girl Scout too, right? So,
Congratulations.
so I'm going to have them both back on, as you see, because we totally ran out of time with all these very important topics. But thank you both.
Thank you very
for
much.
being on the show and sharing your concerns with the community and getting the word out. Stacy Lockhart from Shade Tree and Liz Ortenburger from Safe Nest. Both now, they're connected, so they're going to be connecting with everybody else out there. Invest in Us, the Shade Tree fundraising campaign. So Las Vegas, do what you can. These two organizations are very, very important. We'll see you again next week here on Live Las Vegas with Rikki Cheese.